In the spring of 1822, on a sugar plantation along the lower Mississippi River, a clerk recorded a birth that did not fit. Inside the column lines provided for it, the ledger was already old when he opened it that morning. The leather cover had softened at the corners from years of handling, and the paper inside had yellowed unevenly, the result of humidity, smoke, and time. It was the plantation's principal register: births, deaths, purchases, losses, disciplinary notes, and transfers. Each page was ruled with care. Names in one column, sex in another, age, condition, remarks most. Entries were brief, functional, designed to move quickly from one line to the next. Female child, born healthy. Male infant, stillborn. Twin boys, weak constitution. But on this page, beneath the date March 14th, 1822, the clerk hesitated. His pen hovered longer than usual. When he finally wrote, the ink pressed too hard into the page, leaving a groove that can still be felt today. The child, according to the record, had been born alive. The mother was listed by name. The father was not listed at all, and in the remarks column, instead of a single word or phrase, there were 4 full lines of text. That alone was unusual. What followed was something else entirely. The clerk described a birth that, by the medical understanding of the time, should not have occurred as described. He noted physical conditions that contradicted one another. He referenced examinations by 2 overseers and a visiting physician. He used language that appears nowhere else in the book, terms that were tentative, legal, and almost defensive, and then at the bottom of the entry, there was a mark not used anywhere else in the ledger, a diagonal cross, drawn through the remarks column, extending into the margin. Years later, someone else would write beside it, in a different hand and different ink, entry sealed by order. There is no explanation given for the order, no signature attached to the instruction, no reference to a statute, a court, or a church authority, just the words. And the crossed lines, this is the record of what plantation documents later referred to, obliquely, as the impossible birth. To understand why that phrase appears at all, and why the records surrounding it were later restricted, altered, and partially removed, we need to begin not with that child, but with the system that produced the record. In 1822, Louisiana was not simply a slaveholding society. It was a bureaucratic one. Plantations of a certain size operated as semi-autonomous administrative units. They maintained internal legal systems, medical practices, and record-keeping standards that mirrored those of the state, but were not always subject to its immediate oversight. Owners were expected to maintain accurate registers not for moral reasons, but for economic ones. Enslaved people were assets, and assets required documentation. Births mattered because births increased value. Deaths mattered because deaths required explanation. Anything irregular mattered because it might invite scrutiny. The plantation where this birth occurred, its name appears in some documents, but not others, was large, profitable, and well-connected. Its owner held ties to regional courts and commercial houses in New Orleans. The overseers were literate men, trained to write reports that could withstand outside review. The physician who appears briefly in the birth entry had previously testified in at least 2 inheritance disputes. This was not an isolated or poorly managed operation, which makes the record all the more strange. The mother listed in the entry was a young enslaved woman, approximately 16 years old by the plantation's own age register. Her name appears elsewhere in the ledger, always in short. Neutral entries, rations issued, labor assigned, punishment received for absence from the fields during illness. Nothing marks her as exceptional. Prior to the birth, she is not listed as pregnant in earlier months. That omission is not unusual. Pregnancies were often under-recorded, but it becomes relevant later. When we examine the timeline implied by the remarks, the birth took place at night according to the entry. That detail is included. Most births were not timed so precisely. The child was delivered without the presence of the plantation midwife, who arrived only after the event had concluded. That detail is also included, and then comes the description itself. The clerk writes that the child was born with fully formed limbs and evident vitality, but immediately follows this with a notation that gestational indicators were inconsistent with recorded term. He does not explain what those indicators were. He does not need to. The physician's shorthand of the period assumed a shared understanding among educated readers. The implication is clear enough. By the plantation's own timeline, this child should not have been capable of surviving birth. The remarks continue. The physician examined the infant shortly after delivery. He confirmed signs of respiration. He confirmed independent movement. He confirmed that the child lived for a measurable period of time, long enough to be observed, handled, and assessed. And yet, he also noted features that suggested a much earlier stage of development. In modern terms, we might speak of prematurity, congenital anomaly, or error in dating. But in 1822, those explanations did not fully exist. There was no neonatal care as we understand it now. Survival below a certain developmental threshold was considered impossible, not improbable, which is why the clerk writes what he writes next. He does not declare the birth miraculous. He does not declare it fraudulent. He declares it incongruous with known precedent. That phrase appears nowhere else in the ledger. What follows is a description of what the overseers did next. They did not celebrate the birth. They did not immediately record the child as an addition to the labor force. Instead, they isolated the mother and infant. They summoned the physician again. They delayed entry into the official inventory. They notified the plantation owner, who was not present at the time, and they began writing. This is the part that later archivists would find most disturbing. Not because of its content alone, but because of its tone. The remarks do not read like an observation. They read like a defense. The clerk notes that all actions were taken in good order, that no external persons were present, that no irregular assistance was involved. He emphasizes that the mother had not been previously ill in a way that would account for alteration of term. He notes that no injury or intervention occurred during delivery. These are not details normally included in a birth record. They are details included when someone anticipates questions. Within 48 hours. According to a later annotation, the child died. That fact is recorded elsewhere. Not in the original birth entry, but in the mortality register. The cause of death is listed as failure to thrive, a phrase that, at the time, functioned less as a diagnosis and more as a closure. It required no further explanation, but the birth entry remained. It was not crossed out. It was not corrected. It was not removed. Instead, years later, it was sealed. To understand why sealing was even an option, we need to understand how plantation records were used. Beyond the plantation itself, registers like this one were not private diaries. They were legal instruments. They could be produced in court. They could be audited by creditors. They could be examined during estate settlements. They could be reviewed by church authorities when questions of baptism or burial arose, anomalies in such records were not merely curiosities. They were liabilities. An impossible birth raised questions about the accuracy of other entries. It raised questions about paternity, timing, and consent. It raised questions about medical competence and oversight. Most dangerously of all, it raised questions about ownership. If a child was born under circumstances that could not be explained within accepted frameworks, its legal status might be challenged. And in a system built on the precise definition of human property, ambiguity was intolerable. So the records were not destroyed, they were controlled. At some point, no document records exactly when the plantation ledger was altered. Not by erasure, but by restriction. The diagonal cross through the remarks column was added. The marginal note appeared, and subsequent copies of the register, prepared during estate transfers, omitted the remarks entirely. Only the date and the mother's name remained. The child disappeared from the copied record, but the original ledger survived. It survived because it had to. Original registers were often retained precisely because they could not be altered without leaving traces. They were proof that the system functioned as it claimed to function, and yet, here was proof that something within it had not behaved as expected. For decades, the sealed entry attracted little attention. It sat among thousands of other lines, its crossed ink fading slightly differently than the surrounding text. Only when the ledger was transferred to a parish archive in the late 19th century did someone unfamiliar with the plantation's internal logic pause long enough to notice it. That archivist made a note in the margin of the catalog, not the ledger itself. Unusual birth entry, restricted remarks, no further comment. It would be easy, at this point, to treat the impossible birth as a medical curiosity, to ask what condition might explain it, to search for modern diagnoses that could reconcile the contradictions. But that is not what the record itself is concerned with. The record is concerned with procedure, with observation, with containment. The people writing in that ledger were not asking how the birth occurred. They were asking what it meant for the system that recorded it, and to understand that we need to look more closely at the woman whose body became the site of that contradiction. Her age, her labor assignments, her sudden absence from the fields in the weeks preceding the birth. The punishments were recorded afterward, because while the child's life was brief, the response to its existence unfolded over months. In the weeks following the birth, the mother's entries change in subtle but consistent ways. Her work is reassigned. Her rations are adjusted. She appears in the disciplinary column morphed in for infractions, described vaguely as insubordination and failure to attend. There is no direct mention of the birth again, but the rhythm of the record shifts around her name, and then, several pages later, there is an entry that at first seems unrelated, a note regarding the plantation physician's contract, amended to include additional reporting, obligations for irregular cases. The language is dry, administrative. It does not reference the birth, but the timing is exact, which suggests that whatever the impossible birth represented, it was not treated as an isolated event. It was treated as a precedent and precedence. In bureaucratic systems have a way of multiplying. Before we move further into the aftermath, we need to pause and examine the category into which this birth could not fit. The assumptions about gestation, race, inheritance, and bodily legitimacy that structured plantation medicine, the unspoken rules that defined what could and could not be recorded as real, because the reason this birth was sealed is not simply that it was strange. It is that, if taken seriously, it threatened to expose contradictions that the entire system depended on remaining invisible. And those contradictions begin not with the child, but with the way time itself was measured on the plantation, how weeks were counted, how pregnancies were estimated, and how bodies were expected to conform to schedules imposed upon them, schedules that, as this record suggests, did not always hold, especially when the body in question was not allowed to speak for itself, and when the truth of what happened could only be inferred from ink, margins, and the spaces where explanation was deliberately withheld, spaces that grow more significant the longer one looks at them, until it becomes impossible to ignore the fact that the record is not merely incomplete, but carefully arranged to guide the reader away from certain conclusions that begin to form anyway, slowly, as one traces the repetition of language, the sudden formalism, the shift from routine notation to defensive precision, and starts to realize that the impossible birth was not feared because it could not be explained, but because explaining it would have required acknowledging forces at work on the plantation that were never meant to be written down at all, forces that operated quietly, routinely, and with the full knowledge of those who maintained the ledgers, even as they pretended in ink and in court that such forces did not exist, forces that, once glimpsed through a single anomalous entry, have a way of drawing the eye back again and again, until the reader begins to see similar absences elsewhere, similar hesitations, similar moments where the pen presses too hard, and where the record seems to pause just briefly, before continuing on as if nothing has happened, as if the system itself had not momentarily revealed a crack that would widen over time into something far more difficult to seal. To understand what the plantation clerks meant by inconsistent with recorded term, it is necessary to understand how time was measured on the plantation not as a biological reality, but as an administrative one. Pregnancy in the ledgers was not a medical condition so much as a scheduling problem. A pregnant enslaved woman represented a temporary reduction in labor output, followed by a potential increase in long-term value. As a result, the fact of pregnancy mattered less than its predicted duration. Overseers tracked when a woman could be expected to slow down, when she might be reassigned, and when she would be returned to full labor. Those estimates were not made by physicians. They were made by overseers. An overseer would note changes in gait, posture, and fatigue. He would mark a woman as heavy or encumbered in the labor column. Sometimes a month would be written beside her name. Sometimes nothing at all. The system did not require precision, only predictability, which is why this birth unsettleth record keepers so profoundly. According to the ledger, the mother had not been marked as encumbered at any point prior to the night of the birth. Her labor assignments remained consistent. She worked in the fields until 3 days before delivery. No reduced rations, no altered duties, no midwife consultations recorded. In other words, by the plantation's own internal calendar, she was not supposed to be anywhere near term. This is not speculation. It is visible in the ink. The labor log shows her hoeing cane in early March. The weather notes indicate damp conditions and cold mornings. These were not light tasks. The plantation would not have assigned them to a woman visibly close to childbirth, not out of compassion, but out of efficiency. Injury and loss were expensive. So when the child was born alive, fully formed, breathing, and moving, it did not simply contradict medical expectations. It contradicted the plantation's entire method of temporal control. Time on a plantation was not neutral. It was imposed. It organized bodies into cycles of productivity. It assumed that those bodies would behave in predictable ways. This body did not. The physician's language reflects that discomfort. He does not accuse the overseers of negligence. He does not accuse the mother of deception. He instead refers repeatedly to discordance and misalignment, words that imply error without assigning blame, but error, in this context, was not acceptable. An error in gestational timing raised the possibility that other forms of timekeeping were also flawed, that punishments had been misapplied, that labor quotas had been miscalculated, that ownership blame might be vulnerable. And there was another problem. One, the record does not nama directly, but circles around with careful distance. Paternity. In the ledger, the father column is blank. That too is not unusual. Enslaved children were rarely assigned paternity unless it served a specific purpose. But in this case, the absence becomes conspicuous because of the surrounding detail. When a birth was routine, paternity did not matter. When a birth was irregular, it mattered very much because gestational timing was one of the few indirect ways plantation authorities could infer sexual activity without recording it. If a woman became visibly pregnant at a certain point, assumptions could be made about when conception occurred and, by extension, under what conditions. An early or late birth disrupted those assumptions. The clerk does not speculate in writing. But the defensive tone of the entry suggests that speculation was already happening. Who had access to the woman during the months in question? Were there periods of illness or isolation not recorded? Was there an encounter that could not be acknowledged without implicating someone whose name could not appear in the ledger? These questions are not written down, but the system responds as if they are being asked. In the days following the birth, the mother is reassigned away from field labor. Officially, this is described as recovery. Unofficially, it places her under closer supervision. Her work moves indoors. Her interactions narrow. Her movements become easier to observe. At the same time, the overseer's logs become more detailed. Minor infractions that might previously have gone unrecorded now appear in full sentences. A missed bell, a delayed response, an improper tone. Each entry is small, but together they form a pattern. Documentation is being intensified around her. This is not discipline alone. It is surveillance. The system does not know what to do with the birth, so it tightens control around the person who produced it. The child's death, recorded 2 days later, might seem as though it would resolve the problem. Without a living child, there is no asset to classify, no future labor to account for. The anomaly could be closed, but the record does not relax. Instead, the sealing of the birth entry suggests that the danger lay not in what would happen next, but in what had already been written. The problem was not the living child. The problem was the documented contradiction. When the child dies, the physician submits a brief mortality report. It is formulaic. It does not mention the earlier concerns. It does not mention gestational inconsistency. It uses accepted lang and closes the case, but the birth entry remains uncorrected. That is critical. If the physician or overseers believe the birth had been misrecorded, they could have amended it. They could have altered the date. They could have added a note of error. They did not. Instead, they left it intact and later restricted access to it, which suggests that, whatever explanation they privately accepted, They did not want it subjected to external scrutiny. Because external scrutiny would not only ask medical questions. It would ask legal ones. In Louisiana in 1822, questions of inheritance, manumission, and ownership could hinge on birth circumstances. While enslaved status was passed through the mother, exceptional cases, particularly those involving ambiguous parentage or procedural irregularities, had occasionally been brought before courts, rarely successfully. But the mere possibility was enough to make planters cautious. A birth that did not align with expected gestation could invite inquiry into whether the child had been conceived under circumstances that violated the plantation's own stated rules that were themselves often performative, but still necessary to maintain the appearance of order. This is where the language of sealing becomes important. Sealing did not mean erasure. It meant controlled visibility. The record existed, but only certain people could see certain parts of it. This allowed the plantation to preserve internal consistency while limiting external exposure. The diagonal cross through the remarks column is not random. Similar marks appear elsewhere in plantation records, always in connection with entries that intersected with legal vulnerability, disputed deaths, injuries involving white employees, and births that overlapped with ownership transfers, the cross signals. This information X but is not for general review. And then there is the marginal note, entry sealed by order. Order from whom? There is no name, but the phrasing implies authority beyond the overseer. Overseers did not issue orders of sealing. Clerks did not either. Such instructions typically came from the plantation owner or his legal representative, which means that at some point after the birth, perhaps months, perhaps years, the ledger was reviewed by someone with enough distance from the event to see its risk. By that time, the mother's situation had changed again. Her name appears less frequently. Her labor assignments shift unpredictably. There are gaps in her record days, sometimes weeks, where nothing is noted at all. This is unusual for someone previously so consistently documented. Gaps in plantation records are rarely accidental. They indicate absence, reassignment, or deliberate omission. At one point, her name disappears entirely for a period of nearly 3 months. When it reappears, she is listed among a different work group, with no explanation given for the transfer. Transfers were usually noted, even briefly: sent to Westfield, assigned to Mill, removed to House. This one is silent. Silence in bureaucratic documents is rarely neutral. It suggests a movement that did not fit existing categories. We cannot say, from the surviving record, where she went during that period. But we can say that it coincides with the time when the plantation owner was engaged in a legal dispute unrelated, on the surface, to the birth. A dispute involving property boundaries and creditor claims. During such disputes, plantation records were often gathered, reviewed, and prepared for possible inspection. It is not difficult to imagine someone noticing the birth entry then, not because they were searching for it, but because it did not behave like the others. 4 lines of remarks. Defensive phrasing. Medical uncertainty. A living child where none should have been. In a ledger designed to normalize human lives into predictable units. This entry refused normalization, and normalization was essential. The entire system depended on the belief that enslaved bodies followed natural laws that could be quantified, anticipated, and exploited. Deviations threatened that belief. If a child could be born alive outside accepted parameters, what else might not conform? If time could not be trusted, what about age? If age could not be trusted, what about labor capacity? If labor capacity could not be trusted, what about value? These questions did not need to be articulated to be dangerous. They only needed to be implied, which is why the record responds not with explanation, but with containment. The birth is sealed. The mother is monitored, then moved. The physician's reporting obligations are quietly expanded. The system adapts, not to understand the anomaly, but to ensure it does not destabilize future accounting. And yet, despite all this effort, the impossible birth does not fully disappear. It leaves traces. It alters language. It introduces new caution into the ledger. It creates a precedent for sealing that will be used again, though rarely. And it draws attention decades later. Precisely because of the care taken to obscure it, archivists who encountered the ledger long after slavery had ended were not looking for evidence of cruelty. They were cataloging materials according to historical interest. Most plantation records were repetitive to the point of monotony. This one was not. The archivist who first noted the sealed entry did not comment on its content, but the act of flagging it suggests recognition of its difference. That difference is what later researchers would notice, too, not because they expected to find something extraordinary, but because the document itself insisted, quietly, that something had gone wrong with the usual process of recording reality, and that insistence becomes stronger when one compares this ledger to others from the same period. Other plantations recorded premature births. They recorded stillbirths. They recorded infants who lived only hours. But they did not record births described as impossible. They did not employ language of incongruity. They did not seal entries unless there was a reason beyond the biological, which brings us back to the question the record avoids naming, not how the child was born, but under what conditions did conception occur. The plantation ledger, for all its detail, cannot directly record sexual violence. It cannot record coercion that implicates authority. It cannot record encounters that violate the narrative of order it is meant to uphold. Instead, it records outcomes, a pregnancy, a birth, a death, and when those outcomes do not align with the system's expectations, the system responds by tightening control over information rather than confronting what produced the discrepancy. The impossible birth, then, is not impossible in a biological sense. It is impossible in an administrative one. It is a birth that cannot be reconciled with the plantation's official understanding of time, labor, and authority without acknowledging forces that operate outside the ledger's permitted categories, and those forces, unnamed, unrecorded, but heavily implied, are what the sealing attempts to keep at bay. As we move further into the record, those implications become harder to ignore, because similar patterns begin to appear elsewhere, not always attached to births, but to moments where bodies behave in ways that resist prediction, where the ink grows heavier, the language more careful, and the silence more pronounced, moments that suggest that the impossible birth was not an isolated failure of accounting, but an early warning of something the plantation system could not fully control, something that would surface again and again in different forms, leaving behind the same marks, defensive phrasing, altered procedure, and a quiet insistence that some things, once written down, must not be allowed to be read too closely, because reading them closely would require acknowledging what the record has been designed from the beginning to deny an acknowledgement that begins to take shape here. In the shadow of this single sealed entry, and that grows more unsettling the longer one follows the trail it leaves behind. If the sealed birth entry unsettled later readers because of what it implied, it unsettled the plantation's administrators because of what it forced them to confront about their own records. Plantation ledgers were not neutral mirrors of reality. They were instruments of control. They translated human lives into units that could be measured, compared, and exchanged. For that translation to work, the system required consistency, not truth in an abstract sense, but internal coherence. When coherence failed, the failure had to be managed. One way to manage it was by isolating the anomaly. Another was by adjusting the surrounding procedures so that future anomalies could be absorbed more quietly. That adjustment begins to appear in the months following the impossible birth. The physician's contract amendment, noted briefly in the plantation correspondence file, expanded his obligations in cases described as irregular. The language is vague. It does not define irregularity, but it specifies that in such cases, written reports must be submitted, not only to the overseer but directly to the owner's agent. This change did not apply retroactively. It applied going forward, which suggests that the birth was treated not as an error to be corrected, but as a risk to be mitigated in the future. The ledger itself also changes. From mid-1822 onward, pregnancy indicators become more frequent and more standardized. Women are marked as encumbered earlier. Gestational months are noted more consistently. There is a visible shift toward preemptive documentation. The system is learning, but learning here does not mean understanding. It means tightening the grid so that deviations can be caught sooner, contained faster, and explained away more efficiently. The mother's trajectory within this shifting system becomes harder to trace. After her unexplained absence and reassignment, her name appears sporadically. When it does, the tone of the entries has changed. Where earlier notes were terse and factual, later ones are clipped, almost irritated, unfit for task, delayed, non-compliant. None of these entries mention illness. None mention injury. They function as justifications rather than descriptions. Then abruptly her name disappears again. This time, it does not return. There is no death entry, no transfer record, no sale notation. This is not unprecedented, but it is rare when enslaved people were sold. It was usually recorded, if only to reconcile inventories. When they died, it was almost always recorded because death affected value and accountability. A disappearance without explanation suggests one of three possibilities: removal to another property under the same ownership, informal sale without proper documentation, or deliberate omission. We cannot determine which from the ledger alone. What we can determine is that her disappearance occurs shortly after the sealing of the birth entry. That temporal proximity matters. It suggests that the effort to control the record extended beyond ink and paper. It extended into the management of people. If the woman herself embodied the contradiction the system could not resolve, removing her from the visible record would reduce the risk of further anomalies. This is not an argument for intent. It is an observation of pattern. Plantation systems did not require conscious cruelty to produce cruel outcomes. They required only the consistent application of rules designed to prioritize order over human complexity. The impossible birth disrupted order. The response was to restore it. Meanwhile, the sealed entry remained, quietly embedded in the ledger. When the plantation changed hands in the 1830s, New inventories were prepared. The copied registers list births and deaths, but the impossible birth does not appear. The mother's name appears only once, without context, in an inventory summary that does not align chronologically with the original ledger. This discrepancy would later draw the attention of a 19th century legal clerk tasked with reconciling old records during a property dispute. His marginal notes, preserved in a separate file, express mild confusion. He writes that earlier registers contain matter not carried forward. He does not elaborate. It is unclear whether he was denied access to the sealed remarks or simply did not pursue the inconsistency further. In either case, the system's strategy worked. The anomaly did not enter the official lineage of the Plantations documentation. It survived only in the original ledger, now increasingly obscure for decades. No one seems to have looked at it closely. The record passes from active administrative use into archival storage. Its function shifts from control to memory. And with that shift comes a change in vulnerability. Archives preserve not because something is useful, but because it exists, and existence, over time, invites interpretation. When the parish archive acquired the ledger, it was cataloged according to standard practice. Births, deaths, transactions. No attempt was made to cross-reference entries or resolve inconsistencies. The sealed entry remains sealed, but sealing in an archive is not absolute. It relies on convention rather than force. Anyone with access to the ledger could see the cross, the marginality, and the unusual density of text. Anyone trained to read historical documents could sense that something was being withheld, which is what eventually happened. In the early 20th century, a local historian researching plantation medicine requested access to several ledgers from the region. His focus was not slavery per se, but the development of medical practice in rural Louisiana. He noted the sealed entry in his research notes, describing it as peculiar and overwritten with caution. He did not transcribe it in full, but he did copy one phrase, incongruous with known precedent. That phrase stayed with him. He mentions it in a footnote of an unpublished manuscript, speculating that it might refer to a congenital anomaly or a misdated pregnancy. He does not suggest anything more, but the fact that he noticed it at all indicates that the entry continued to exert a quiet pull on attentive readers, because the language is not that of medical curiosity. It is the language of institutional anxiety. The ledger is not surprised by the birth. It is threatened by it. To see why, we need to step back from the individual case and consider the broader assumptions embedded in plantation record-keeping. One of the most important of these assumptions was that enslaved bodies were transparent, that their conditions, capacities, and limitations could be observed, measured, and known by those in authority. This assumption justified control. If bodies were predictable, then control was rational. If they were legible, then exploitation could be optimized. The impossible birth undermined that assumption. It suggested that something could occur within an enslaved body that escaped surveillance. That time could be misread. That sign could be overlooked. That outcome could surprise. This was not merely inconvenient. It was destabilizing, because if one body could defy prediction, others might as well. And if prediction failed, so did the system's claim to mastery. This is why the response focused so heavily on documentation rather than understanding. The goal was not to learn what had happened, but to prevent the system from being questioned. And this is where the sealed entry takes on a broader significance. It is not unique. because of what it records. Is unique because of how it records it. The 4 lines of remarks are not descriptive. In the way medical notes usually are, they are justificatory. They anticipate scrutiny. They insist on procedural correctness. This suggests that the writers were less concerned with explaining the birth than with defending themselves against potential accusations, negligence, impropriety, and failure of oversight. In other words, the birth was already being framed as a problem of governance. That framing matters because it shifts responsibility away from natural causes and toward institutional ones. And institutions, when faced with evidence of their own limits, often respond by closing ranks. The sealing of the entry is an act of closure, but closure is never complete because the ledger continues to exist. And because its internal logic can be read against itself, contradictions accumulate. For example, the Plantations' reported birth rates before and after 1822 show a subtle but noticeable change. Births are recorded earlier. Stillbirths are described in more detail. The language of certainty increases. This may reflect broader trends in medical documentation, but it also aligns too neatly with the timing of the impossible birth to be coincidental. The system has been shaken, and it is compensating. What it cannot compensate for is the absence of the woman. At the center of the event. Her disappearance leaves a gap that no amount of procedural adjustment can fill, and that gap becomes more significant when one considers what is not recorded about her. There is no mention of her consent, no mention of her experience, no mention of her interpretation of what happened. The record treats her body as a site of anomaly, not as a source of testimony. This is not unusual for plantation documents. But in this case, the absence feels more pronounced because the system is clearly aware that something has gone wrong. It simply does not know how to articulate it without undermining itself. So it does what bureaucratic systems often do. It narrows its focus, limits access, and moves on. But the impossible birth resists being moved past. It lingers, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a pressure point that reveals the fragility of the structures built to contain it. As we continue to follow the trail of this sealed entry, it becomes clear that its significance does not lie in whether the birth can be explained by modern medicine. It lies in how the record responds to the challenge it poses, because that response, sealing, omission, procedural tightening, and quiet removal of the person most directly involved, reveals more about the plantation system than any straightforward account ever could. And as we look beyond this single ledger to related documents, correspondence, contracts, inventories, we begin to see echoes of the same pattern elsewhere. Moments where the record hesitates, where language becomes evasive, where authority asserts itself most forcefully, not in moments of confidence, but in moments of uncertainty, moments when the system encounters something it cannot fully explain, and therefore must control. A pattern that, once recognized, becomes difficult to unsee, because it suggests that the impossible birth was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader landscape of events that strained the limits of what plantation bureaucracy could acknowledge, events that, taken together, point toward forces operating within that world that were never meant to be documented, forces that shaped lives and outcomes even as they remained officially invisible, forces that the sealed entry gestures toward without naming, and that we must now attempt to approach carefully through the gaps, silences, and defensive ink that surround it. As we move closer to the question the record avoids most persistently, not how the birth happened, but why acknowledging its true circumstances would have threatened the very foundations of the system that tried and failed to contain it. To approach what the record avoids naming, we have to read not just what is written, but how writing itself changes around moments of strain. Plantation documents are often described as monotonous, and in many ways they are. Their power lies in repetition. The same columns, the same phrases, and the same assumptions carried forward year after year. That monotony creates an illusion of stability. It suggests that life on the plantation followed predictabler his and that disruptions were rare and manageable. But when something threatens that illusion, the writing shifts. In the case of the impossible birth, the shift is subtle but unmistakable. The clerk's handwriting tightens. Sentences grow longer. Qualifiers multiply. Where the ledger usually moves quickly, here it slows. As if the pen itself is hesitating. This hesitation is not confusion. It is caution. Caution appears most clearly in what the record refuses to specify. The physician does not list measurements. He does not note weight, length, or developmental markers beyond vague phrases. This is striking because physicians of the period often took pride in observational detail, especially when confronted with unusual cases. Such detail demonstrated expertise. Here, detail would have been dangerous. Measurements fix things in place. They make claims testable. They invite contradiction. Vagueness, by contrast, allows multiple interpretations to coexist without being resolved. Inconsistent with recorded term does not say how inconsistent. Evident vitality does not say how long it lasted. Known precedent does not specify whose. Knowledge counts. The language is deliberately elastic. This elasticity serves a purpose. It allows the entry to exist without committing to a single explanation that could be challenged. And yet, elasticity has limits. The very act of acknowledging inconsistency is already a concession. It admits that something has slipped outside the system's expectations. To understand why that admission was so risky, we need to examine the plantation's assumptions about reproduction. More closely, enslaved reproduction was treated as both natural and managed. On the one hand, it was framed as an inevitable biological process requiring minimal intervention. On the other hand, it was subject to constant surveillance because it affected labor supply and property value. This dual framing created a contradiction. If reproduction was natural, then it should be predictable. If it was managed, then deviations implied managerial failure. The impossible birth exposed that contradiction. If the child truly developed faster than expected, then natural laws were not behaving as assumed. If the pregnancy had gone unnoticed, then surveillance had failed. If conception had occurred under unusual circumstances, then control had been breached. Any of these possibilities was unacceptable. So the record chooses a different path. It acknowledges the anomaly without explaining it. This is not ignorance. It is strategy. And strategy becomes more visible when we look at related correspondence. Among the plantation's surviving papers is a letter from the owner's agent to a legal advisor, dated several months after the birth. The letter does not mention the child or the mother. It discusses routine matters, crop yields, repairs, and staffing. But near the end, almost as an afterthought, the agent writes that recent events underscore the necessity of discretion in internal matters, particularly where medical judgment and record-keeping intersect. This sentence is easy to overlook. It is also telling discretion is not called for when everything is functioning smoothly. It is called for when something has gone wrong and the wrongness cannot be openly addressed. The phrase medical judgment and record-keeping intersect is especially revealing. It suggests that the problem was not purely medical and not purely bureaucratic, but emerged at their intersection where observations about bodies met the formal structures used to control those bodies. The impossible birth sits precisely at that intersection. The agent's letter does not specify what discretion should look like. It does not propose changes, but it establishes a principle. Some things should remain internal, unexamined by outsiders. This principle helps explain why the record was sealed rather than destroyed. Destruction would have drawn attention. It would have created a gap that required explanation. Sealing, by contrast, preserved the appearance of completeness while limiting interpretive access. The record could be produced if demanded, but its most troubling part would remain officially off limits. This approach reflects a broader pattern in how plantation systems dealt with uncomfortable realities. They did not deny them outright. They compartmentalized them. Violence, illness, and sexual exploitation, these were not absent from plantation life, but they were rarely named directly in official documents. Instead, they were refracted through euphemism, omission, and procedural language. The impossible birth is a case study in this process. The ledger does not record an assault. It does not record coercion. It does not record fear. It records an inconsistency, and that inconsistency is treated as a technical problem. But technical problems, when examined closely, often reveal moral ones. Consider the timing again. The child is born alive at a point when, according to the plantation's own tracking, the pregnancy should not yet have been advanced. This implies either that gestation progressed unusually fast or that conception occurred earlier than recorded. The latter possibility raises questions about why conception was not recorded or, more precisely, why signs of pregnancy were not acknowledged. There are several possible explanations, none of which can be confirmed from the record alone. The woman may have concealed her condition, fearing punishment or exploitation. The overseers may have ignored early signs, either through negligence or convenience. The conception may have involved someone whose actions could not be safely documented. The record does not choose among these explanations, but its behavior suggests that at least one of them was understood to be dangerous. Because if the issue were simply miscalculation, a correction would suffice. If it were a medical anomaly, a detailed case study might follow. Instead, we see silence, restriction, and removal. This pattern becomes even more striking when we examine how the plantation handled other irregular births. In the same ledger, there are entries describing infants with visible deformities, infants who lived on minutes, and infants born after difficult labors. These entries are often blunt. They name conditions. They assign causes. They move on. None of them are sealed. None of them involve defensive language. None of them prompt changes in physician contracts or record-keeping procedures. The difference is not the strangeness of the event. It is the threat it poses to the system's authority. The impossible birth threatens authority because it suggests that something significant happened beyond the reach of surveillance and control. And surveillance was central to plantation power. Overseers watched bodies in the fields. Clerks watched them on the page. Physicians watched them in moments of illness and injury. Together, These forms of observation created a web of visibility that was meant to be total, but total visibility is an illusion. There are always moments that escape notice, especially when those moments involve private encounters, coercive acts, or forms of resistance that leave no immediate trace. The impossible birth may be one such trace, not because it proves a specific event, but because it marks the point where the system's claim to omniscience breaks down. This breakdown is what the sealing attempts to repair. By restricting access to the entry, the system limits who can ask questions. By removing the woman from the record, it removes a potential source of further anomalies. By adjusting procedures, it reduces the likelihood of similar disruptions in the future. These are not the actions of a system confident in its control. They are the actions of a system reacting to vulnerability, and vulnerability, once exposed, tends to propagate. In the years following the impossible birth, the Plantations' records show an increasing emphasis on compliance, order, and documentation. Language grows more formal. Deviations are noted more quickly. There is less tolerance for ambiguity. This tightening does not eliminate irregularities. It merely pushes them further into silence, which is why, when we read the ledger today, the sealed entry stands out so starkly. It is not loud. It does not dramatize itself. It simply refuses to blend in. Its presence disrupts the monotony of the page. It invites questions precisely because it tries to prevent them. And those questions multiply as we widen our lens beyond this single plantation. Similar sealed or restricted entries appear in other ledgers from the region, though rarely in connection with births. More often they involve injuries to overseers, unexplained deaths, or disputes over responsibility. In each case, the pattern is the same: detailed initial documentation, followed by restriction and silence. The impossible birth fits this pattern too well to be dismissed as an oddity. It belongs to a category of events that strain the plantation system's capacity to explain itself without contradiction. What makes it distinct is that the strain originates in reproduction, a process that the system depended on but could not fully control. Reproduction involves bodies, but it also involves time, intimacy, and power relations that do not always align with bureaucratic schedules. When those elements fall out of sync, the result is not just a medical anomaly. It is a challenge to the system's narrative about itself. The ledger responds by narrowing the narrative, but in doing so, it leaves behind traces that later readers can follow: the crossed lines, the sealed remarks, the disappearance of a name. These traces do not tell us exactly what happened. They tell us what could not be said. And that unsayability is the key to understanding why the impossible birth mattered so much, because the threat it posed was not that it revealed something extraordinary about biology. It was that it revealed something ordinary about power, that control is never complete, that systems built on domination are always vulnerable to the bodies they seek to manage, and that when those bodies behave in ways that cannot be neatly accounted for, the system's response is not to listen but to close ranks, restrict access, and move forward as if the problem has been resolved, even when it has merely been hidden, a hiding that cannot erase the marks left behind, marks that continue to speak, quietly but insistently, to anyone willing to look closely enough at the page, to follow the ink where it thickens and thins, and to recognize that the silence surrounding the impossible birth is not an absence of meaning, but the clearest indication of where meaning became too dangerous to record openly, an indication that grows more compelling as we approach the final set of documents connected to this case, documents that do not describe the birth at all, but that reveal how deeply its shadow extended into the plantation's administrative life, shaping decisions, altering practices, and reinforcing the boundaries of what could and could not be written down, boundaries that, once established, would persist long after the event itself had faded from living memory, leaving behind a sealed entry that continues to unsettle because it marks the point where the record acknowledges its own limits, and where the truth it cannot contain begins to press outward, demanding attention even now, nearly 2 centuries later.